I used to believe that if I just worked hard and stayed true to my values, recognition would eventually follow. But when you step into a room full of people who share your last name, and every glance scans you from your shoes to your buttons, you start to realize some families don't measure worth in love, but in assets. I'm Evangeline, 32 years old, a finance lecturer at a community college in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I was the only grandchild who lived with my grandmother in her final years. I thought that bond would tie me to the family's legacy, but at the annual gathering at the Sheffield estate, surrounded by relatives flaunting Rolexes and tossing around crypto talk like it was a casual hobby, I got called Grandma's broke little shadow. If you've ever had to choose between dignity and family, leave a comment, hit like, share this story, and follow the channel so you won't miss what comes next. When I stepped into the grand foyer of the estate on a crisp October morning, the click of high heels and clinking crystal echoed like warning bells. The house still held its traditional Spanish architecture, red-tiled roof, golden sandstone walls, but the atmosphere had shifted. Within a few steps, 3 sets of eyes had already sized up my light gray blazer like it was a trash bag. Julia, Nathan's wife, gave a subtle smirk when she saw the leather bag I was carrying. It was a gift from my grandmother when I got into college. A simple, handmade piece with no brand label, just fine stitching and a small note tucked inside. Never let anyone teach you to live by labels. I heard Grace whisper to her husband as I passed by, "She's still driving that old Ford Focus?" He shrugged. "What do you expect from a community college teacher?" I meant to brush it off, like I always did, but this time my briefcase didn't just carry lecture notes. Inside were documents proving I hadn't stayed out of the family's financial game. I'd just played by different rules. My grandmother, Eleanor Sheffield, had been the only one in the family who believed that wealth wasn't the loudest voice in the room. After my grandfather died, she ran Sheffield Realty with quiet precision. I moved in with her at 15 after my parents died in a car accident, returning from a volunteer trip. Those 3 years, she'd hand-grind coffee each morning, flip open the daily paper, and slide a finance journal across the table to me. Every night, she'd go over the ledger and ask what I thought about her latest investment in a new housing development out west of Albuquerque. Most people in this family forget that real estate isn't just about land value, it's about the lives on that land, she once said as she folded her planning sheet. I learned from her, slow, steady, and quiet. While my relatives chased flashy projects in Austin, Houston, even Vegas, I started with a rundown duplex in Espanola, living on one side, renting the other. I rolled that income into 3 small apartment blocks, then into a forgotten shopping center near campus, all of it under the Sheffield West Investment Fund, formed by her trusted attorney. None of them knew the luxury condo they were living in, the one with the saltwater pool and vintage wine cellar, was now mine. When I sat down on the long couch in the main parlor, right beneath the aged portrait of our company's founder, my great-grandfather, my cousin Brittany raised an eyebrow. "Still going for the minimalist look, huh?" She grinned, her diamond earrings catching the light. I nodded, eyes on my cup of mint tea. Still works. Before anyone could toss another jab, Martha, the longtime housekeeper, stepped in and gave me a kind smile. "You're early, Miss Evangeline. Mr. Connor's been here since morning, strategizing, if you know what I mean." I followed her up to the 2nd floor, back to the room I once stayed in. The cream curtains, dark wooden shelves, and little reading nook by the window still looked the same. In the drawer sat the old leather investment journal, still bookmarked at my first entry, a $1,000 stake in a local trust. Suggested by Grandma. The house itself, Santa Rosalia Estate, was the family's crown jewel. Word had spread during last night's dinner that Uncle Connor planned to sell the whole property to build a luxury resort. I placed my briefcase on the desk and opened it, fingers brushing over the stack of papers. Ownership deeds, share transfers, valuation reports on over a dozen properties under my control. If things played out the way I suspected, tomorrow they'd be sitting here, arguing over what to do with Grandma's last legacy. And none of them would see it coming, that the one they dismissed might be the only one who could stop it. I didn't expect it, but that was just the beginning. The next morning, sunlight cut through the cream curtains, spilling gold onto the armchair by the window. The soft chirp of mountain birds floated in from the distant pines. I sat up, pulled on a light cardigan, and walked over to the desk. The documents were still neatly stacked, waiting. I helped Martha in the kitchen. She looked older, more bent, but her eyes still twinkled. Mr. Connor's downstairs with the lawyers, she said, pouring coffee. Doesn't look like he came here for nostalgia. I took a sip, strong, bitter enough. I don't think today's about memories, I replied, then set down my mug and walked out to the back porch. The stone path to the greenhouse still wound its way behind the estate, where Grandma once grew lavender. I stood by the withered rose hedge, remembering afternoons trimming stems with her. Investing's like tending a garden, she'd say. Be patient, it blooms when it's ready. Those moments clung to me as laughter echoed from the dining room. I skipped the family breakfast. I needed quiet before walking into the storm. By 9:30, I returned to the main parlor. The room was more formal this year. Leather chairs lined up around a long meeting table, a projector already connected to display charts. A folder with the Sheffield Realty logo sat center stage. My cousin Logan, fresh from Stanford, was adjusting his tie while chatting with his blonde girlfriend, laughing over his new portfolio in Austin. Across from them, Celia was thumbing her phone, metallic red nails tapping fast. Only one person met my gaze. Nora, a pediatrician and Aunt Gloria's daughter. She nodded. I nodded back. It was the kind of quiet recognition you give someone who's also learned how to sit still in a room full of noise. Evangeline, Uncle Connor began, his tone all business. We'll start with the family portfolio overview, then move into discussion of the estate and investor proposal. I took my seat and opened my notebook. My heart was still, but not frozen. Just ready. Ready after years of being underestimated. Connor walked us through the asset breakdown. Sheffield Realty held major commercial properties along the West Coast, including 6 developments in progress. The Santa Rosalia estate was labeled unutilized asset. He quickly shifted to a slideshow on potential for luxury resort development. With over 10 acres, this land is perfect for a Sheffield signature retreat, he said, pointing at the plans. And with majority family approval, we can lock in the deal by next week. My hand grazed the folder in my bag. Not yet. This home was where Grandma lived for nearly 40 years, I said evenly. She once told me if any place deserved to stay whole, it was this one. Silence fell. Then Celia let out a dry laugh. Do you think we turned down an 8-figure offer just for the sake of nostalgia? Logan chuckled under his breath. Or maybe you just don't have enough assets to understand real value? Uncle Connor kept his tone neutral. We understand Evangeline has an emotional connection to this place, but emotions don't pay property taxes. These projects do. Nora leaned slightly toward me and placed her hand gently on mine beneath the table. A silent gesture, but enough to remind me I wasn't entirely alone. They continued discussing numbers, profit margins, demolition costs, and development models. Each sentence felt like a paper thin cut across memories of the lavender garden, Grandma's old study, and the balcony where I used to study on summer afternoons. I stayed silent. I just observed, jotting down every figure, every mention of share percentages, every person who voiced agreement. The meeting wrapped up around noon. They left the room visibly energized, chatting about lunch on the patio and the bright future of the family estate. I gathered my notes, slipped them into my bag, and stood up. As I stepped into the hallway, Logan looked back and grinned. Hope you're not taking this personally, Evangeline, but sometimes you've got to leave the old stuff behind to move forward. I didn't respond. I just looked him straight in the eye, then turned away and walked toward the rose garden behind the house. That's where I knew I'd still hear my grandmother's voice in the wind. And I knew that this afternoon, while they laughed under the eaves, I would be making my first move. I wasn't planning to retaliate. I planned to reclaim. And I knew exactly how. I left the rose garden just as the clock struck 1. The sun was sharper now, reflecting off the manor's glass windows, nearly blinding if you looked too long. On the patio, I could hear the clink of wine glasses and bursts of laughter from Logan and Celia as they retold the story of an overseas investor who once mistakenly paid $500,000 for a lot barely bigger than a little league field. I headed straight to the study, the one place I knew I wouldn't be disturbed. It used to be where my grandmother spent hours every afternoon reading reports and writing letters. The old ebony file cabinet was still there, along with a desk with its smoky glass top. I locked the door behind me, pulled my briefcase from the bookshelf, and set it on the desk. Every file was exactly in place. Property deeds for the Midtown apartment building, the formation documents for Sheffield West Investment Fund, commercial lease agreements with local small businesses. Among the contracts was the most critical document of all, the deed transfer for Park Crest, the apartment complex where Logan, Celia, and both of my uncles currently live. They still thought the building belonged to some obscure real estate firm out of Chicago. I didn't buy it to one-up anyone. I bought it because Grandma had marked that parcel nearly a decade ago. When the previous owner passed away, no one in the family paid attention to the note she'd written in her leather-bound planner. Midtown will turn within a decade, buy if the chance arises, and hold it for those who understand long-term value. I remember clutching that note all evening after getting the email that the property was quietly up for sale. 3 weeks later, I liquidated equity from 3 smaller buildings and went all in on the deal. I didn't tell anyone, only Mr. McAllister, Grandma's longtime attorney, was fully in the loop. That night, I called him. I need you to prepare all necessary documentation to reveal ownership within 3 days, I said, eyes locked on the contract before me. Are you sure? He asked, not surprised, just cautious. Once this goes public, there's no walking it back. I paused a few seconds, then nodded, even though he couldn't see me. I've got no reason to hide anymore. He agreed. Within 24 hours, the legal team would send appraisals, transaction records, and ownership documents, transferring Park Crest to Sheffield West Investment Fund, the entity I controlled completely, though my name wasn't listed anywhere. After the call, I sat quietly by the window. Grandma used to say, when the time comes, you won't need many words, just the right paperwork. That night, I reorganized all the files. Clear labels, detailed tenant lists, upgrade schematics from the past year. I had proof that the building's value had increased nearly 20% over the past 12 months. Among the 100-plus tenants, no one had been displaced or gouged on rent. I also prepped a special report, an analysis of the land where the manor stood. If interpreted properly, it would show that maintaining preservation status could yield more sustainable value than converting it into a resort. With those numbers, I wasn't going to argue from sentiment. I was going to counter with strategy. The next morning, while everyone else was still having breakfast on the patio, I caught Nora in the hallway. She was scrolling through her phone, probably hospital emails. Can I talk to you for a minute? I asked. She looked up and nodded. Reading room? I nodded back. The small room at the end of the hall, once filled with Grandma's investment books and notebooks, still held the scent of aged wood and dried tea. I closed the door, opened my briefcase, and handed Nora a copy of the Park Crest deed. She read the company name, then flipped to the next page. Her expression shifted from surprise to disbelief. You're behind Sheffield West? I simply nodded. And the building Logan lives in? That's yours? And Celia's, I added. Both uncles, too. Nora perched on the edge of the desk and exhaled slowly. They're planning to pressure the current owner into selling. Connor said last night he has someone at zoning who can nudge things along. I looked at her. That's why I needed you to know. If things go south at the vote, I'll go public. But if we can avoid that, I'd rather time it right. She didn't ask anything else, just quietly folded the document and returned it to me. You don't have to do this alone. I didn't say anything. I just squeezed her hand, a bit of warmth in a house that had felt cold for far too long. As I left the room, the morning meeting was being set up in the main sitting room. Uncle Connor was in the center, speaking to a silver-haired man I didn't recognize. I figured he was the investor. I returned to my room and locked the door behind me. Then I opened my laptop and checked for messages from McAllister. In my inbox, there was a new file, the Park Crest Appraisal, signed yesterday, with confirmation from 2 independent firms. I downloaded it and saved it to a flash drive. Tomorrow, if necessary, I would present it during the meeting. And if they still didn't understand what I was holding, then I'd let them feel the consequences of underestimating the only one who still carried Grandma's legacy. I didn't know how they'd react, but I was certain of one thing. The game was no longer in their hands. That evening, dinner was held in the South Banquet Room, the largest space in the manor, with high ceilings, oak-paneled walls, and crystal chandeliers that had hung there since before I was born. Martha said she once saw my grandmother use the room to host public school students back in the 80s. Now it had become the stage for my relatives to show off their latest acquisitions. Swiss watches, Italian leather wallets, or the Louis X chair Uncle Connor playfully won at auction in Paris. I wore a simple indigo linen dress with long sleeves, gently cinched at the waist. Around my wrist, a worn silver bracelet that once belonged to my mother. As I entered, Celia's gaze swept over me like she was appraising each item. "Vintage dress," she murmured as I passed. "Unusual fabric." I smiled. "Worn, but it holds up." Our place settings were assigned by name, written in gold ink on thick cards. I was seated at a corner table next to Nora, far from the center, where Connor sat across from a man in a gray suit, hair slicked back and gleaming. "Who's that?" I whispered to Nora. "Derek Wells, representative from Caldera Partners. Heard they want to turn the estate into a boutique resort." I nodded, still watching them. Connor was laughing, raising a glass of red wine, and Wells nodded approvingly. Watching them chat felt like reliving a scene from an old movie, one where a legacy was about to be stripped away with a glossy contract. As the appetizers were served, the conversation at our table shifted to holiday plans. Logan talked about a ski trip in Telluride, while Celia gushed about the villa she just rented in Sedona. "What about you, Evangeline?" Logan turned to me, his grin laced with teasing. "Still spending the holidays in Santa Fe every year?" "Yeah," I replied, adding salad to my plate. "I like the quiet." "Quiet, sure, but that old house still not fixed up," Celia added, then turned to her boyfriend with a wink. "Evangeline lives pretty minimalist." I set down my fork slowly. "Minimalist makes it easier to avoid debt collectors, doesn't it?" That made Celia pause, while Logan laughed aloud. I looked at them for a beat, then resumed eating. Nora let out a soft breath, her smile tilted just slightly. Throughout dinner, Connor kept bringing up community value and long-term direction for the family legacy. Every phrase landed like part of a well-rehearsed speech. Eventually, he raised his glass. "We stand at a rare opportunity. Caldera is prepared to invest tens of millions to transform this place into New Mexico's newest destination. I believe this is the right moment for the Sheffield family to make its mark." A few scattered claps followed. I didn't join. I looked over at Nora. She didn't clap either, just looked at me, quietly. When dessert was served, Derek Wells stood up with a smile and presented a few points about the resort concept. His delivery was smooth, the visuals projected on a wall-mount screen, infinity pools, mountain view spas, a helipad, all the things my grandmother would have called soulless. After his presentation, Connor rose. "Tomorrow, we'll hold a preliminary vote. Anyone in support of the project, please be ready to share your stance." Brad, one of the quieter cousins, but always in alignment, stood up first. "If we refuse, this estate will keep deteriorating. Who's paying for upkeep then? I believe this is a chance to elevate the family's asset." Celia nodded vigorously. "And if anyone still thinks this place holds historical value, cracked plaster doesn't pay electric bills." I listened, but didn't respond. Not tonight. After people began to leave the table, I stood and walked straight toward the back garden. Nora followed without a word, until we stood beneath the lilac trellis. If you don't speak tomorrow, they'll sign, she said, her voice light as the breeze. I nodded. I know. But I want them to say everything they're thinking. The more they reveal, the easier it'll be to counter. She looked up at me. Are you afraid they'll turn on you? I'm not sure they ever turned toward me. A brief silence, then Nora squeezed my hand. Then don't hold back. Tomorrow morning, do what you need to do. I returned to my room in silence, shut the door, and slid the lock. On the desk, the black folder still sat where I left it. I opened it for a final check. Every document numbered, clearly labeled. I pulled out the last sheet, the ownership certificate showing Sheffield West Investment Fund's deed to Park Crest, and placed it in a separate black folder. When I turned off the light and lay down, no dreams came. Just the flicker of my grandmother in memory, sitting by the desk, teacup in hand, lips curved in a knowing smile, like she was waiting to see what I'd do next. Tomorrow morning, everything would change, and they'd have to face what they'd ignored for too long. Sunday morning in Santa Fe was colder than usual. When I opened the window, mist still clung to the edge of the tiled roof and drifted over the wildflower beds below. The scent of damp earth mixed with Earl Grey in the room calmed me more than any caffeine could. I chose a white mandarin collar blouse, gray slacks, and a charcoal wool coat. Not flashy, not loud, but crisp and firm. Every movement was measured, deliberate. When I fastened the old pearl earrings that belonged to my mother, my palms were no longer cold. The conference room had been reset, chairs arranged in a U-shape, with a projector and whiteboard up front. On each seat was a packet stamped in red by Sheffield Realty and Caldera Partners. Connor sat at the center, in the same light gray suit from last night, chin slightly raised, fingers interlocked, as if chairing a shareholders' meeting. I entered last. No one spoke as I sat down. Only Nora gave me a subtle nod. Connor scanned the room before standing. Today will begin the preliminary vote. But first, everyone will have the chance to share their views on the project. I flipped open the front page of the packet. The title read, Sheffield Legacy Redevelopment Initiative, a fancier name for tearing down a legacy to build spas and jacuzzis. Brad spoke first. He went on about investment benefits, access to fresh capital, and unlocking real value from estate land. Celia talked about upgraded living spaces, premium services, and rebranding Sheffield's image for the new generation. Every speech ended with applause from the relative seated near the center. I stayed still, jotting down a few notes in my journal. Recycled talking points, no mention of sustainability, evasion of heritage. Connor invited me to speak last. I stood, holding the black folder I had brought from my room. Thank you all for sharing, I said, voice steady and clear. I don't oppose change, but I do oppose erasing everything in exchange for a shiny blueprint. I placed the folder down in front of Connor. In that packet is an independent appraisal showing that the historical value of Santa Rosalia Estate, if preserved and registered as a state heritage site, could generate up to $3 million in grant funding over 5 years. I've also included a proposal to convert the estate into a community center with gallery space and a family archive. Connor furrowed his brow and opened the packet, while Brad let out a short laugh. I thought you came here for a meeting, not to pitch a charity project. I looked him straight in the eye. I came to defend the legacy of the person who taught me that money doesn't define value. Celia crossed her arms and tilted her head. If you care that much about preserving it, why didn't you fund it yourself? I stayed silent for exactly 3 seconds, then flipped open my USB drive and plugged it into the projector. Up on the screen appeared the asset breakdown of Sheffield West Investment Fund, the fund I control. Then came the ownership certificate for Park Crest, the building where Celia and Logan currently live. I said nothing. I let them read it for themselves. Logan leaned forward. What is this? I'm the owner of that building, I replied. I purchased it 2 years ago, renovated all the plumbing and electrical systems, upgraded the amenities, kept the original tenants, and never used any family name leverage to do it. The room fell silent. Connor stared at me, jaw clenched. So you've been hiding your financial capabilities all this time? I wasn't hiding. No one ever asked. No one responded. Brad leaned back in his chair, glanced at Celia, and shook his head. I powered off the projector and pocketed the USB. I don't need their recognition, but I won't let them turn this place into a soulless resort. Nora was the first to clap. One beat, then another, then just silence. Connor tapped his fingers on the table. All right, let's move forward with the vote. All in favor of the Caldera project, raise your hand. 8 hands went up. Opposed? Just me and Nora. 2 votes. Not nearly enough to shift any outcome. But I didn't feel defeated. I felt like I had planted something that truly mattered. And I knew this wasn't the end of the game. Because what I was about to do would force them to re-examine the entire structure of power they thought they controlled. That afternoon, the sky turned gray faster than usual. The clouds hung low, pressing against the Sangre de Cristo mountains in the distance, and the air on the estate grew heavy in a way I couldn't quite name. After the morning vote, most of the relatives dispersed to their rooms or gathered on the back patio for cocktails, acting as if everything had already been decided. I didn't join them. I sat in my grandmother's old study, idly twirling a pen across the glass-topped desk. On the computer screen was a copy of the sale contract between Sheffield Realty and Caldera Partners. Unsigned, but complete with placeholders for signatures, terms, and a closing date. I zoomed in on the line reading, estimated share payout, a cascade of numbers, each one a slice of inheritance stripped from the roots of memory. I opened another email window and clicked on the message from Mr. McAllister. All transfer paperwork into Sheffield Legacy Trust is complete. Assets from Sheffield West Fund have been consolidated to purchase controlling interest in Sheffield Realty. Ready to finalize any time. The study door creaked open. Nora stepped in, carrying 2 glasses of iced tea, condensation dripping along the rims. Figured you'd be here, she said, setting a glass on the desk. They're already talking about the spring groundbreaking. Connor called the architect. I didn't look up. They think it's done. And you? I took a sip of tea. Cold, lightly sweet. I think it's time to begin. Nora nodded, then silently pulled out her phone and switched on the voice recorder. I didn't ask why. She knew exactly where this was heading, and we needed evidence to make sure it couldn't be denied when I acted. At exactly 3 o'clock, I stepped back into the conference room. The setup had been rearranged again for the final session, confirming next steps, as Connor put it. A whiteboard at the front read in large marker, Phase 1 Demolition Timeline. I stared at that line for a long moment, then walked to the head of the table. No one spoke as I inserted my USB into the projector. Before we go any further, I said, my voice as even as always, I'd like to update everyone on some recent changes in the company's ownership structure. Connor frowned, and Brad leaned back with arms crossed. Are we getting another sentimental lecture? I clicked to the first slide, the ownership certificate for Sheffield Legacy Trust, the legal entity I had registered just yesterday. I've acquired all shares previously held by Sheffield West Fund and several dispersed stakeholders totaling 38.7%. The room froze. I also purchased indirect holdings from 2 of my grandmother's former partners in the Santa Fe branch, bringing my total voting power to 51.3%. Connor shot to his feet. Impossible! Where did you get the money? I didn't answer. Instead, I clicked to the next slide. Sheffield West's public financial reports from the past 10 years, showing portfolio growth, investment returns, and fully legal transactions. I started with a small inheritance like every other cousin, but instead of buying luxury cars and vacation packages, I invested in what my grandmother once taught me, long-term value. Brad's face reddened. So, you're the one who bought the building we live in. That's right, I upgraded the elevator you used to complain about. From the back, Nora tapped her phone, playing the recording, Connor's voice from the previous night, clearly audible over speaker. Just apply enough zoning pressure and the developer will fold. We let it play to the part where he laughed, saying, "We have leverage. She doesn't even know what she's messing with." No one spoke. Connor looked at me, his face hardening like he was calculating his retreat speed. If you've ever stayed silent because no one believed you or were blamed just for speaking the truth, leave a comment. Share this story if you think someone out there needs to hear it. I turned off the recording, pulled out the USB, and said clearly, "The estate sale contract cannot proceed without majority shareholder approval, and currently, Sheffield Legacy Trust holds veto power." I paused for a beat. However, I didn't come here for revenge. I came to restore what Grandma believed we had forgotten: kindness, consistency, and integrity. Celia flicked her hair back, her voice quieter than usual. "So, what are you going to do?" "I'm keeping the estate, turning it into a financial education center for the local community. Part of it will be named after Grandma. The Eleanor Sheffield Resource Center. Anyone who wants to contribute is welcome." Connor sank into his chair, eyes fixed on the table. Brad said nothing. No more laughter, no more smirking. And in that moment, I didn't feel like I had won. I just felt that things had finally settled into their rightful place. But I also knew this was only the beginning of a much deeper rebuild, not of property, but of relationships. And not everyone would be ready for that. After that afternoon's meeting, the air in the estate noticeably shifted. Gone were the clinking glasses and vague chatter about upcoming beach trips. People scattered, each in their own direction, and footsteps along the wooden hallways started sounding heavier. I guessed no one really knew how to face me after what I'd done, or rather, after I forced them to see what they had spent years ignoring. I returned to my room, closed the door, and opened the window to let in the late afternoon breeze. From here, I could see the rose garden, where Grandma and I used to sit for hours, tea in hand, reading from old investment magazines. I sat in the small chair near the window and picked up the notebook she had left behind. On the cover, there was a faint brown ink stain she once told me she never erased, because it reminded her that even she had made mistakes. I flipped to one of the last pages. A line in purple ink read, "Silence held too long can be a form of shirking responsibility." I laid my finger on that sentence, my eyes lingering. A gentle knock came at the door. I got up and opened it. It was Celia. She wore a beige sweater, her hair tied low, none of the polished look she usually had. She held a white mug in her hand and didn't meet my gaze immediately, just stood there for a second. "I'm not here to argue," she said, voice one note softer. "I just wanted to understand." I stepped aside. "Come in." Celia sat across from the writing desk, placed her mug down, and clasped her hands. "Why didn't you say anything all these years, if you had all of this?" I sat down across from her. "Because I wanted to be remembered as Evangeline, Eleanor's granddaughter, someone kind and hardworking, not just another name slapped onto the family scoreboard." She looked at me for a moment. "You could have stayed quiet and no one would have known. But instead, you revealed everything, changed the shareholder structure, and held onto the estate. Was that to prove something?" I shook my head. "Not to prove anything. To keep a promise." I told her about the mornings learning to read financial reports with Grandma, the times I followed her to neglected buildings just to hear her explain the potential of each wall, each street. And her final reminder that I didn't need to become a Sheffield by their standards, but if I kept her spirit, I had every right to stand in this house and decide its future. Celia said nothing, her eyes drifting to the window where the breeze was beginning to stir the last few remaining leaves. "Maybe I never understood her the way you did," she said, almost exhaling. "I thought she was just quiet, clinging to old things." "She held on to what was worth keeping and let go of what wasn't," I replied. "Most of us, this whole family, never cared enough to ask what she actually wanted." Celia didn't respond, but her gaze softened. She stood, picked up her mug, and paused at the door. "What will you do next?" "I'll turn this place into a community center with a library, free financial literacy programs for single parents, new immigrants, and education students, like my mother used to be." Celia nodded. "If you need someone to design the interior space, I could help." I was surprised, but I nodded. "I'll keep that in mind." She left. I remained at the door, watching her disappear down the hallway. In that moment, I understood. Not everyone turns away and not everyone apologizes. But when someone is willing to listen, at least the door to conversation doesn't stay closed forever. That evening, when Nora stopped by with a box of chocolates and her old joke, "You'll need the sugar to keep carrying this whole family," I laughed. It had been a long time since I laughed that freely in this house. We sat under the porch, listening to the wind stir through the roof tiles, the warm glow of the living room lights spilling onto the steps. "From here on out," I said, eyes lifted to the sky, black and smooth like velvet, "everything's going to change, not because I won, but because I'm not staying silent anymore." Nora leaned back, her hands wrapped around her tea. "Ah, they have no idea what's coming once you truly begin." I smiled. "They don't, but they're about to find out." The next morning, I woke to the sound of wind chimes brushing gently outside the balcony. The sun had just risen, and light streamed through the sheer curtains, bathing the room in a soft glow. I got up, folded the blanket, and sat at the desk, where the file from last night still lay open. The handwritten notes lit up under the sun, each line steady and precise, as if Grandma were still here, somewhere in the room, checking the numbers with me. I spent the entire morning organizing every document tied to Sheffield Realty, Sheffield West Fund, and Sheffield Legacy Trust. It was no longer about protecting individual assets. I needed to rebuild an entire system, from how cash flow was monitored to how we communicated with the community. Around 10 o'clock, I received a message from Mr. McAllister. "Emergency shareholder board meeting requested by Richard, 11 a.m. today. Be present." "Emergency?" I repeated aloud. But I wasn't surprised. I changed into a charcoal suit with a mandarin collar white blouse, no jewelry, just a small silver rose pin, Grandma's gift when I received my first scholarship. The boardroom wasn't as full as before. A few chairs were empty, most belonging to those who now realized they had no role after yesterday's announcement. But at the head of the table, Richard sat, colder than usual, his hand resting on a folder stamped with the Caldera Partners logo. "I called this meeting," he began, "to question the validity of the recent transfer of voting rights." "What exactly are you questioning?" I asked, pulling out my chair. "The transfer didn't go through the Family Advisory Board, and if Sheffield Legacy Trust holds ownership, we have grounds to raise a potential conflict of interest." I looked straight at him. "No one in this family questioned your decade-long accumulation of voting power. I did this legally, transparently, and without using any personal leverage from the Sheffield name." Richard leaned slightly forward. "You can cite legal precedent all day, but there's one thing you still—" I raised an eyebrow. "And what's that?" "The approval of this family. You may keep the assets, but you'll never earn the right to lead with honor." I let out a quiet laugh. "Honor? You're talking about the honor of people who've tried to edge me out for years, who plotted to manipulate city permits just to take back a building they've been leasing below market value?" No one responded. Brad stayed silent. Celia stared at her hands, and Logan pretended to scroll through his phone. I opened my briefcase and took out the new strategic plan for Sheffield Legacy Trust. 3 pillars: transforming the estate into a community hub, a scholarship fund for education majors, and a financial literacy program for low-income parents in Santa Fe. "I'm not here to win anyone over," I said. "I'm here to bring this legacy back to what Grandma lived for." Martha walked in with a tea tray. Her eyes passed over the room and settled on me. She placed the cup gently in front of me and said, "Jasmine tea. Mrs. Eleanor's favorite." I nodded my thanks. That look, from someone who had witnessed 3 generations of Sheffields, meant more than any vote ever could. After the meeting, as I walked down the hallway, Brad quickly stepped in front of me. "Evangeline, hold up." I stopped, arms crossed. "What?" "Listen, I know I've said stupid things. I've acted like a jerk. But if there's any chance, I still want to help. I'm a civil engineer. I could redesign the courtyard for the center." I studied him for a long moment, trying to tell the difference between genuine remorse and personal agenda. But I also knew, if I had the power to rebuild from scratch, I had to learn how to filter, not just cut. "Send me a concept draft within a week," I said. "I'll review it." He nodded and walked away, shoulders less tense than when he arrived. On my way back to my room, I passed Richard standing on the back porch, glass of wine in hand, staring out at the garden, now slightly wild after the season. He didn't turn when he heard my footsteps. "Your father once told me," he began, "that Eleanor believed you had a better eye for long-term value than anyone else in the family." I laughed at that. I said nothing. "I'm not laughing now." He turned toward me. No apology, no anger, just a quiet acknowledgement, like someone who realized they'd lost. Not because of one move, but because they never understood the game. I nodded once and walked on. No words needed. Everything had already been said in action. That night, I stayed in the study late. The wind tapped against the window, shifting the curtains softly, as if reminding me that more resistance was still coming. And sure enough, the next morning, something unexpected appeared in my inbox. A request from the local government. I read the email again, my eyes pausing on the subject line. RE Views suggests zoning and historic preservation. Santa Fe City Planning Office had requested additional documentation for the estate's transformation into a community center. Reason? The property is designated for historical preservation and requires architectural and residential impact assessments. I took a deep breath. Not a major roadblock, but no walk in the park either. Everything was by the book, but someone had clearly sounded the alarm to slow the project down. Around noon, I called Lindsay, a community attorney I'd worked with back in Chicago. After I explained the situation, she paused, then said, "Someone's stalling, not blocking, just delaying." "Would Richard have enough connections in city planning?" I asked. "With a few people on the Heritage Review Board? Possibly. But we've got leverage too. If you've got documentation showing the project serves the public interest and keeps the original structure intact, they won't be able to hold it back for long." I pulled out the old project binder, flipping to Brad's drawings from the other day. The redesigned courtyard doubled as an event space, the original wood-framed greenhouse preserved with a manual glide glass roof. Classic, but practical. I called Brad, asking him to prepare a 3D model for the next board presentation. There was no room for hesitation now. That afternoon, I met Martha in the kitchen. She was holding a bunch of fresh dill, gazing out at the garden. "I think you once said Grandma loved this place," I said. She nodded slowly. Every summer morning, she'd sit on that stone bench beneath the maple, held a book but rarely read, said the place taught people how to be still. I looked out toward the bench. Moss had crept up the stone legs, and the lavender swayed gently in the breeze beside it. And keeping it all, not demolishing anything, just adding a few side rooms for the community space. Martha didn't respond right away. A moment later, she stepped over and placed her hand on my shoulder. "You don't need to say that to make her proud. She trusted you'd protect what mattered, not for the family's name, but for the memories built into these brick walls." I walked away with her notes on Grandma's stories and the lives that once filled this estate. Every line, every memory would be part of the upcoming presentation, not just paperwork, but living history. On Monday morning, Lindsay and I attended the hearing at the Heritage Review Board. The meeting room was modest. Old oak panels and black and white photographs lined the hallway. Across from me sat 3 board members, older than I'd expected, each with a pen in hand, their expressions weary. Lindsay opened with the legal groundwork. I followed with the operational plan. Then came the presentation. Brad stood up and presented the 3D model, his voice steadier than I remembered. When the screen showed the redesigned courtyard with the new greenhouse, one of the board members gave a slight nod. I ended with a quote from one of Grandma's old letters. "If you want to preserve family values, don't cling to the material, hold on to what can be passed on." After the meeting, one of the board members, Mrs. Caldwell, silver hair and bright eyes, approached me. "You're Eleanor Sheffield's granddaughter?" "Yeah, she taught me when I was in 3rd grade. She used to write quotes on the board every morning. I hated those at the time. Now, I still remember every word." She smiled, then gripped my hand firmly. "I think she'd be very proud." That afternoon, I received an email from the Heritage Board. "Preliminary approval. Project may proceed under agreed conditions." I set my pen down and leaned back in my chair. The early autumn breeze had cooled noticeably. The first leaves had begun to fall. The house was quiet. No more arguments, no more sense of defense. Then the phone rang. Richard's name flashed on the screen. No text, no voicemail. I set the phone down. I didn't answer. I didn't need to anymore. 4 months after final approval, the Sheffield Community Center officially opened on a crisp winter morning. Santa Fe was dusted in a light layer of snow, just enough for the air to carry hints of pine, cinnamon bark, and that slight chill that made people tuck deeper into their coats. I arrived early, just as the sun began rising over the low hills to the east. The old house still wore its deep red brick exterior. The greenhouse frame shimmered in the morning light like a warm glass lantern. At the front entrance, people were setting up a tea table, hanging welcome signs, and tuning a small string ensemble for the opening ceremony. No one mentioned Richard's name. No one asked if I was moving back into the old house. Everyone simply called me Evangeline, the one who turned an old estate into a place where the community could rediscover itself. At 10 o'clock, Martha arrived in a thick wool coat, holding a card. "You should read this," she said, her eyes moist but steady. "It's from your mother. Found it in an old book while clearing the attic." I opened it quietly. The handwriting was familiar, aligned, a bit stern. "Evangeline, if you're reading this, I may no longer have many chances to speak my heart. I've never been good at showing it, but that never meant I didn't care. I've done many things wrong by you, left gaps you never deserved to carry. But I still hope, one day, you'll know I loved you in the clumsiest way someone like me could." I folded the letter and slipped it into my coat pocket. Not to forgive, but to close the chapter. The crowd began to grow. Children ran across the sanded paths. Adults chatted, pointing out restored corners of the home. One nook had become a public library where people could trade old books. Another served as a tea room, furnished with oak tables and locally crafted ceramic mugs. I stood beside Brad as the band played their opening notes. "I didn't think it would turn out this perfect," he said, still looking at the courtyard. "It's not perfect, but it's enough to start again. Are you staying in Santa Fe?" I didn't answer right away. I looked around and saw a little girl helping her grandmother fold a tablecloth. A group of student volunteers was cleaning the glass doors. An elderly man, hands slightly shaking, still managed to raise his teacup in a toast with old friends. I turned to Brad. "I don't know. But I'm no longer afraid to stay." We stood quietly after that, no need to say more. Later that afternoon, when most of the guests had gone, I walked the grounds. The maple tree behind the house was still bare, but the moss around its base had been swept clean. Someone had placed a pot of white chrysanthemums on the old stone bench. Small and simple. I sat down. The wind lifted my hair. Cold, but not harsh. From my coat pocket, I pulled out the card from my mother and a pen. On the back, I wrote a few lines, nothing long. "I've come home, and I've chosen to stay." I placed the card on the bench, not for anyone else to read, but to remind myself. I don't know where you're listening from, maybe in your car, before bed, or on a day when you need a story to help you rise again. Let me know where you're listening from. And if you want to hear more real journeys like this one, don't forget to follow the channel because the next story might be exactly what you need. Evangeline didn't just escape the grip of a calculating family. She learned to stand for her own worth. From a woman who once had to ask permission just to live on her terms, she became someone who decided her own life with trust, persistence, and silent heartbreak. Her story isn't about revenge. It's about reclaiming peace, dignity, and a life no longer defined by anyone else but herself.